10 simple reasons why your knitted garments don't fit. Hi everyone, Norman here. Have you ever knitted a sweater or some socks only to notice that they didn't fit at all, even though you stuck to the pattern down to a T? Well, let's take a very close look at what can go wrong when knitting a garment and how to avoid these mistakes so your next project will fit like the proverbial glove. Negative ease doesn't exist. There, I said it. Well, I strongly believe that hand knitters should ditch the whole concept of negative ease if they want to knit garments that truly fit. Let me explain. I knitted this little swatch here, and most patterns will probably tell you to wash and block your swatch. Now I'm going to ask you, how much should I stretch this swatch when I block it? Like this, or like this? For very obvious reasons, this decision will drastically influence your gauge. With every millimeter you stretch that swatch to the sides, less stitches will fit into your 5x5 gauge square or whatever you are using. However, you simply do not know how far the designer stretched their swatch. So as a result, even though you thought you got gauge, your sweater still won't fit simply because the designer stretched their fabric less than you did. As a result, you could already have blocked out all the negative ease that the pattern relies on, leaving you with extremely stretched out stitches, for example here around the bust area. So when I knit a swatch, I always stretch it out to the point where I am still satisfied with the stitch definition, where I like the fabric my swatch creates. And then for socks or sweaters or other patterns that rely on negative ease, I don't subtract an arbitrary amount of negative ease like 5 or 10% because I can only hope that this negative ease still remains in the fabric based on an equally arbitrary blocking decision. So instead I use the fabric I see in front of me, my swatch, as my bottom line for my sweater. And then I might add positive ease to that. But even for the sections that rely on the negative ease, I use my stretched swatch as the bottom line, as the baseline for my calculations. Like that, I will stay in control, and I will always know that things will fit if I block things just the way I blocked my swatch. And then the stitch definition I create and the fabric I create will 100% please me. A big part of knitting a garment that fits has to do with the correct way to measure. Now, there are tons and tons of resources out there that show you how to measure your body. One would be my sweater tutorial. I link it to you up in here. But there is something people rarely talk about. Knitted fabric like this here shawl here has a certain thickness, and this is important. So I'm going to take a bottle and wrap this piece of paper around it and then mark how much I need to go all the way around. And I'm going to use this shawl here to do the same without stretching the shawl, and then I'm going to mark the spot where I reached around with a stitch marker. Now let's compare that. You will need a lot more fabric, a lot more length here when you use the shawl. The fabric is that much thicker, thus the diameter is also bigger, and thus the circumference. So when you measure yourself, it's very, very important to wear whatever you plan to wear underneath. So in this case, I'm wearing a shirt underneath this sweater. So I would measure myself wearing that shirt. And then on top of that, you need to take into account the thickness of your fabric and actually add that to your calculation. If you use fingering weight yarn, I mean, you can basically ignore it. But if you are working an Aran weight sweater or something like that, where the fabric will be just as thick as this shawl here, then maybe you should take it into account. And in that vein, here is another thing you absolutely need to do. So a good pattern should come with schematics or detailed measurements. Bust or chest circumference, thigh depth, biceps girth, these kind of measurements. And it is essential to counter-check all these measurements diligently. So take a sweater in your wardrobe where you go, okay, this fits nice, and it has a similar construction, and then use a tape measure and compare. It may say size M, but maybe you and the designer have completely different perception of what actually is a medium fit, because there's always all that positive ease or negative ease you add to the pattern, and that differs from the standard sizes. Especially if it is a seamed design, it can also be very helpful to create cutouts. So this here is the cutout I created for this sweater, because as you knit, you can always layer your knitting on top of the cutout and compare, taking into account how much things will stretch out after blocking. And if you are designing your own garments, a cutout like this one here will be your first step. And then if you have some old linen around the house, you could even try to assemble a mock-up. Just cut things out according to your cutout and then use some pins or simple stitches and try things on. We have, I don't know, 5,000, 6,000, I don't even know how many years of advanced tailoring history, and so many smart and time-proven ways to create garments that fit. And sometimes, to me at least, it feels like hand knitters go like, nah, I'll do my own thing, and that's just weird to me. Let's quickly take a look at socks for a change. So there are a million different heel patterns. Heel flap and gusset, German short rows, and so on. Fish lip kiss and sweet tomato and so on. And it's vital to understand that they shape the fabric in different ways. They are not the same. So for example, I have a very high instep, and German short row heels and similar types of short row heels just won't really fit because they do not add enough depth. And the same applies to sweaters as well. And I feel it is very important to understand the difference. If you knit a simple tube across 20 rounds and compare that to a tube where you evenly increased on both sides in every second round, there will not be a difference in height. It simply will get wider. If, on the other hand, you add short rows, the tube won't get wider, but the length on one side will be longer. And this is essential because if you have a big bust and compare this sweater here with this sweater, where is the difference? This line here that is following the bust is a lot longer than this line here. So if you just add increases or decreases, that is not going to change your fit. You need to add short rows here. You need to add bust darts so you get extra length here. Because if you just add increases or don't do anything, if you don't do anything, what will happen is that then this length here stays the same. This means here your hem looks more like this, not very pleasing. And if you add increases and decreases, what will happen is, well, then your shape will be more like this. And you have all these fabric here flapping around and negative ease kind of constricting your bust. That's not what you want either. That's why you need short rows. And the same applies to pronounced shoulders like most men or trans women would have. And then if you knit raglan decreases here, If you decrease slower or faster, what will happen is here the position of your collar, that will change. You can change how wide that sleeve is, but you can't add length here. You can't add length here. That's why you would need short rows, doesn't very look nice, and that's why you typically go for a seam design. Listen, I am all for size and gender inclusive designs wherever it's possible, but at the same time, it is vital to understand the pros and cons of certain common constructions and where their limits are. Because if you don't, you might have knitting a pattern that was never meant to fit you. A bit like if I were to shop panties for women, wondering why they are so tight in the crotch area, and then I buy them 2 sizes larger and suddenly they sort of fit, but they constantly slide down. The same happens if you have those super broad shoulders and knit a raglan sweater. It just doesn't work out. I could probably spend an hour telling you why getting gauge is impossible. In fact, I did a full video on the topic and I'll link it to you up in here, but here is the gist. So, when you measure a swatch, say 5 centimeters or 2 inches, well, it's mere chance that the very last stitch fits fully into that bracket. So, let's do the math. The difference between 5 centimeters is 10 stitches or 5 centimeters is 11 stitches, that is already 10%. And 10% can be a lot more than a full size simply because you counted a stitch that the designer didn't, or vice versa. Now, the bigger your swatch, the smaller this rounding error will be, and this is precisely the reason why experienced knitters will knit a larger swatch and then measure 10 centimeters or 4 inches, and then they measure in different spots and use the average. I will actually measure stitches and see how long they are, because this is precise rather than trying to fit stitches into, a little square. But of course, this still leaves the blocking and stretching issue, and often you don't even know where and how the designer measured their gauge. So did they also measure on their finished garment? Did they use their swatch? So there are many variables and many things that can go wrong. This is not to say that getting gauge is worthless and you shouldn't knit a swatch. It is meant to show you the limits of it. And this brings me directly to my next point. For me, a swatch is something that only gives me a first guess how many stitches I need to cast on. It will, however, provide me with tons of other reliable information. Does the yarn work? Do the colors bleed out? How does the yarn behave after washing? Do my floats peek through when doing color work? Do I need to go down a needle size so my ribbing looks nice? Do my cables look nice? And so on. But in terms of cast on, it's only a first guess. And then after I knitted 20 or 30 rounds, I simply try on my work in progress and counter check. And maybe this means frogging. But then these 20 or 30 rounds, I treat them as my actual swatch. And if you measured your swatch before and after washing and blocking, then you know, okay, this might still be a little bit tight, but I know it's gonna stretch out by 10% and then it's gonna be okay. And I can't stress enough how important it is to treat your work in progress as your actual swatch and be prepared to unravel that bit. For example, if you were to watch my sweater tutorial here on YouTube, you might notice that I prefer to knit my sweaters bottom up. Why? Because it's relatively easy to get a good fit around your standard hip and belly. I mean, it's basically just a tube. And you can even pre-block that, and I do that. Just slide it on some cables, use cable stoppers. dunk it in water, block it, and try it on. And then you have a reliable gauge you can use to calculate the rest of your garment: bust starts, raglan decreases, bind-offs and cast-ons, whatever you need to finish your garments. You have a reliable gauge to work with, rather than using your swatch, your unreliable swatch, where you know it's unreliable, to calculate your whole sweater. Here is another very big issue. So a normal pattern is created like this. The designer knits the sweater, hat, or socks for themselves, and then they or their tech editor, typically it's a tech editor these days, they grade it so there is a wider range of sizes available, and then it's off to test knitting. But that grading is always done using standard sizes. So except you have this miraculous standard size body that is similar to the body of the designer, you need to make your own alterations. Here are a couple of examples. So, bust starts help to accommodate a bigger bust. And if you have a wider hip, well, then cast on more stitches and then add the creases here and here on the back. If you have seen a fitted t-shirt, a shirt before, a fitted shirt always have here these decrease lines on the back. You can do the exact same with sweaters. If you have pronounced shoulders, go for a seam design and then tie around with the sleeve cap length to accommodate those super broad shoulders. That's what you need to do. If on the other hand you have a raglan construction, then you need to adjust here. You will have these decrease lines, and this bit here needs to be as long as your sky depth, so from here to this. So you always need to adjust the frequency of these decreases, because if you blindly decrease or increase in every second round, then you will add a lot extra fabric here below the armpits that's bunching out, that's not going to be pretty. So you need to calculate these decreases. But of course, this also applies to sock knitting. So for example, the German short row heel, it's not well suited for a high instep. But a lot of people say, well, it's very easy to knit. Well, what do? You add a gusset on top of that. So before you even start, 10, 20 rows before you start your German short row heel, you start increasing stitches on both sides. And then after the German short row heel, you start decreasing, and then you add here. You add a little bump here to your fabric, which could accommodate your high instep. Then a lot of people have very small calves, very slender calves. Now, of course, the circumference of your calf is sort of governed by this diagonal, because you need to put on your sweater, your socks. But of course, you can knit a double cuff. So you fold it over, sew it together, or do this knitting techniques, and then you can hide a little rubber band here inside so they don't slide down. Then a lot of people have very sensitive feet, and they complain, well, they don't like the feel of the pearl bumps on their sensitive soles. Well, then knit this portion here in reverse stockinette stitch, so that this is called princess soles. So the smooth side of the stockinette stitch is against your skin, while the pearl bumps are on the outside. So what I'm trying to get across here is there are ways to accommodate basically every little quirk of your body or your preferences, and you just need to educate yourself and modify the pattern yourself. A lot of fitting issues can also be traced back to tension issues, especially when you switch from one pattern to a different pattern. So a good example are your sweaters. So you have beautiful fair isle details here around the neck and around the bust area. Then it's typically just plain stockinette stitch, and the bottom, the hem or so, will be ribbing. And it's very, very important to account for these changes, because all these different fabrics, all these different stitch patterns will have a different gauge and will be more or less stretchy. So for example, here for these socks here, where I added this beautiful lettering using fair isle, I cast on 40 more stitches compared to the inside of the cuff. And the inside of the cuff is ribbing and is knitted with 1 needle size smaller, just to ensure that here these fair isle details don't look like totally distorted, because I had to stretch them out too much, and I can actually fit through because this isn't actually stretchy. Or for example, these socks here and these socks here, it's the same general pattern, it's the exact same yarn and needle size, but for these socks here I needed to cast on a lot more stitches because there are just so many more cables involved. And every time you cross a cable, you are essentially constricting the fabric in that spot, and the more cables you add, the less stretchy it will be. So when you want to knit a complex design like a sweater with different stitch patterns and or different techniques, your swatch needs to reflect that. You can't just knit a swatch in stockinette stitch and go like, yeah, it's gonna be all right. Your swatch needs to have all these different stitch patterns and techniques, so your sweater doesn't end up looking like that, or it might even be too tight to try on. I have a question for you. If you have curly hair and straighten them, what will happen after washing? And if you have straight hair, curl them and wash them, what will happen? They will snap back to the natural state. And sometimes it feels like everyone but knitters knows this. Now I have some sheep wool, some alpaca yarn, and some cotton yarn here. And if you were to look at these yarns under a microscope, you would be able to observe a, peculiar thing. The sheep wool fibers are rather curly. Spinners would say it has a lot of crimp. The alpaca yarn is barely wavy, and the cotton yarn is more or less straight. This is why your sheep wool sweater springs back after washing. You probably observed this with any commercial sweater. It kind of wears out, then you put it into the washing machine, then it snaps back. And this is exactly why your alpaca yarn sweaters wear out, but there is no spring effect. There is no memory effect. Different fibers also retain different amounts of moisture. Cotton, for example, retains a lot of moisture, and that is why we use it for sportswear, for underwear, things like that. But then the fabric also becomes very, very heavy, and it stretches out all those stitches, one tiny little millimeter at a time. But since there is no curly memory like curls have when you straighten them, it just stays that way. Now please, this is an overgeneralization of a very, very complex topic where the fiber, the chemical treatment, and of course the spinning method all play an important role. And obviously there are other fibers beyond these three I just mentioned, and of course blends. So I can recommend 2 books. Yarny Texture, and here the fiber, the fleece and fiber source book. So if you want to know more about fibers, spinning methods, and how they can affect your knitting, then these 2 books are a very, very good start, or rather they dive in rather deeply. So I can really recommend these books even if you aren't a spinner. The big important point here is not reading tons of books. The important point here is to know that a lot can happen to your fabric after washing and wearing it. And this is exactly why it's so important to wash and block your swatch. Measure it before and after blocking, and document the changes, because only trying on your work in progress won't cut it. You have to take into account how your fabric will change with time. So far, I presented you with lots of issues that prevent the perfect fit, and the reality will still be, even if you do everything I recommended here diligently, the results will still be often underwhelming. So when I develop a pattern, it doesn't magically turn out perfect on the first try. Quite to the contrary. I will frequently unravel portions and sometimes even knit 2 or 3 samples. So if you've been following me on Patreon, you would know this, because here these mittens, I think I knitted them 3 or 4 times until I was satisfied. Just think about it. Unlike a tailor who can go to a shop and buy bolts of cloth, you are creating the fabric and sew it together at the same time. And if you spin your own yarn and if you create your own patterns, there are 2 more variables, 2 more things that can go wrong. So I feel it's very important that us hand knitters, that we acknowledge that a little bit of frogging and a little bit of trial and error is part of the process and no sign of failure. And if you compare this to painting, maybe you've seen this before, but they do these X-ray analysis of all these important paintings at museums when they restore them, and then they see all these underdrawing sketches, and sometimes the arm was like that but ended up like that, things like that. And I feel knitting is very similar in that respect. You kind of need to approach the perfect fit slowly. This involves frogging. You need to accept this as part of the process. It's no sign of failure. It's just, the limits of the craft and your creativity. Most importantly, I want you to know that fit is entirely arbitrary. So I knitted this sweater exactly the way I want it to fit, and I'm very satisfied with it. Yet I know for a fact that some people think it's way too tight. And conversely, I often hear people say, well, they never had fitting issues with their raglan sweaters or yoke designs, and the patterns worked out quite beautifully. And then when I look at the pictures, I see how the fabric is bunching out here, too much fabric here underneath the armpit, it's oversized, the bust area is a little bit too stretched out, and sometimes the shoulders sit, more like on the biceps. However, it is not my place to tell them what they should or shouldn't like, and if I take the briefest of glimpses into fashion history, I would soon realize that fitting preferences change dramatically throughout the ages. Just, compare the Roman toga with medieval tights and the kind of oversized suits Charlie Chaplin wore in, and his contemporaries, and the kind of weird shoulder construction they had. And then you have low-rise jeans, baggy jeans, skinny jeans, and if you are my age, you go like, but weren't skinny? No, now it's baggy. No, not anymore. So, these things change so quickly. So you can decide for yourself what you prefer and what you don't prefer. Anyway, I hope I gave you some food for thought. Let me know what you think, and as always, happy knitting and enjoy the rest of your day.